All right, we are now live, it looks like, for the Hegel party. This is not the first of our Hegel parties in the past. We've done some when we hit, I think, 200 videos, when we got into the spirit section. So this is one definitely to celebrate. And the official reason for this celebration is that we're moving at last from the spirit section of the work, the longest section of the phenomenology. So we've gotten this far into the book, and we're moving into the religion section, which is a good portion of it, but much smaller than spirit. Say it's this amount, and then you might say, well, what about the rest of the book? Well, there's Absolute Knowing, which is very short, and then there's all of Miller's notes as well. So this is definitely for me something to celebrate. Let me see if I can brighten. There we go. Brighten this up a little bit. I went in and took a look at the dates on the videos. And the first video in this series was from late February 2004, which means that we have been, working away at this for almost 7 years. I wrote a long time ago in the Half Hour Hegel blog. For some reason, I thought it would take me 2 or 3 years. And even if I had stayed like completely on track, and got 6 videos done per month, I think it still would have taken me, 5 to 6 years. We have probably, if I stay on track, another year or so of the project, and then I'll start thinking about what I'm going to do next. I've already done the sort of half-hour thing for Epictetus's discourses. I'm thinking about doing it when I've got the available time for René Descartes' meditations, using both the original Latin text, the French translation. A lot of people don't realize that, Descartes didn't write the meditations in French. He had it translated into French for him, and then an English translation. And then, I might take on another big book down the line. We'll see. This is a great test of concept, right? Doing this book took quite a long time, actually still taking quite a long time. So I thought it would be cool to take a Sunday afternoon and spend maybe, we'll see how much time when people start asking questions or making comments to respond to. We'll see how long this lasts, maybe an hour or so of chit chat back and forth. I do want to say a few things about the project and about why the religion section is important. So let's start with the second part, right? And then I can tell you about the project in just a bit. So the religion section is the last of the big chunks, right? We had the consciousness, self-consciousness. Those are fairly short compared to spirit and reason, which are much longer, much more involved, a lot more going on there. And then we have this religion section. You might say, well, what's that doing there? Why are we now talking about religion? And Hegel has brought up religion at different points in the work, and that's part of what he's going to talk about in the very first paragraphs, the introductory section. He's going to say, listen, we have talked about religion. The unhappy consciousness is about trying to reach God and not being able to do so. There's religion coming up, the religion of the underworld, and the laws of the gods, and that sort of stuff, and the whole Antigone business in the early spirit section. And there's religion in the discussion about faith, kalba, right? So that's also pretty important too. And Hegel said, we did talk about religion. Now we're going to look at it thematically. And he says a few things in there that are kind of interesting that I'm not going to try to unpack in great detail because that's happening in the commentary videos, but I will point this out. He talks about in that introduction to the religion section, the four previous developments, these threads of consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit together in this phenomenon of religion and its spirit that's coming together, and self-consciousness looking for its you could say objective reality in relation to another, something going back to the self-consciousness section. It's looking for recognition. So all of these things are being brought together now and reworked in some way in the religion section. Now, when you read through the bits and pieces of it, you might be like, well, I don't actually see that happening. And I think that's a valid complaint, actually, quite frankly. The other thing that you might say, well, why this religion section? Why is this coming up here? Hegel thought that religion is basically, a way in which human beings are developing consciousness throughout their history in relation to something divine, something absolute, something eternal, not realizing that they're projecting that outside of themselves. And that religion is essentially sort of like philosophy, but in what he calls picture language, or in representation, Vorstellung. Hegel's not the only person to say this, by the way. I mean, you can see something kind of similar coming up in earlier thinkers, including Averroes, I would say Cicero, if you look at his discussion in On the Nature of the Gods, Book 3. There's a few other authors who are going to say, listen, religion is like, religion is there's a lot of interesting stuff there if we strip away all the superstition and kind of goofy stuff, and we look at what's going on in the development of religion. It's like philosophy, but it's not quite philosophy yet. So it's for people who are smart, but not smart enough for philosophy. Is that Hegel's position? I would say yes, in a way, except that Hegel thinks that there has to be this ongoing development taking place, right? And so you could say that in a certain way, philosophy, in Hegel's sense, becomes available through the development of human beings. And that sometimes includes what was there in past philosophy, but it's like the big guns have come out now, and it's happened in part for Hegel through this walk through religion, and particularly through Greek religion and through revealed religion, the last of which is going to be Christianity. And I guess the last other thing I want to say about Hegel is Hegel is really unorthodox. He is not. He's a Lutheran. He's not an Orthodox Lutheran. Stanley Rosen, in his book on Hegel, and I'm not remembering the exact name, he's considering the issue of whether Hegel's an Orthodox Christian or not, and he says Hegel belongs to a church of one. Namely, it's the church that includes Hegel, and I think that's right. And so you don't want to go to Hegel for like Christian doctrine or something, the way you might go to Augustine. But it's worth checking out. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. I wanted to write my dissertation originally on Hegel and the matter of religion. I did a few early publications when I was, a grad student on that. His lectures on the philosophy of religion are very interesting. If you like this section, I would check those out because there's a lot more substantive discussion of religion in those. So that's probably enough about Hegel and religion. I see a lot of comments already piling up. Let me say something about the project. So how did the project get started? When I first started getting on YouTube, I was uploading class videos, and then people were like, hey, can you do videos on this? Can you do videos on that? Hey, there's Bruce. Hey, thanks, Bruce. Always happy to see you there. Bruce is a longtime interlocutor of mine. I think he's been here really since the start of the project. And there are quite a few people who have been with me the entire way, which is quite cool. So anyway, people were saying, can you do videos on people? And I said, okay, let's look at what the number one requests are. And when I started going through my videos and sort of tabulating it, it was Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and weirdly enough, Herbert Marcuse. And I was like, well, all right, I can do Sartre and Heidegger by like focusing on existentialism. I've gotten, really interested in that again lately. I was interested in my teens and 20s and then kind of let it slide. Let me go back to that. And so I started a whole sequence on existentialism. And what I would do there is I would take a book like Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and devote like 4 one-hour lectures to it, right? And that was adequate. And then I started thinking, okay, what can I do for Hegel? Why don't I go through, since this is the book everybody requests, right? Why don't I go through and work on this? And I was like, can I do this kind of big picture thing? I don't think I can do justice to Hegel and the phenomenology by trying to do that. So does that mean I have to go down to like the paragraph level? That's going to be a lot of work. And then I was like, the hell with it. Let's try it out. And I don't think I don't know where my numbers came from about thinking about how I was going to do this. And it wasn't going to take quite so long, but I started doing it. And, the early videos, obviously I wasn't using my voice recorder that I've got here. So the sound quality is not quite so good. And I was using a flip cam instead of my nice GoPro. So the video quality was not as good, but it works. People got into it. They were able to benefit from it. And I just started, experimenting around with like, well, I guess, I didn't even really think a lot of these things through. I was like, okay, so we got a black background. That's nice. There's me, there's Hegel, there's the description. And then we got through the preface and I was like, oh, we can't do the same background, right? We got to change it up. Let's do white. Okay. And then I video recorded with me be in front of this bamboo thing, I think. Right. And then we got into sense certainty. And I was like, well, the consciousness section, all right, we'll make that this color. And then I came up with a whole color scheme for it. Right? And, it started going on, created a Patreon, which a lot of people have contributed to, which is great because the videos take a lot of time out of my other pursuits that would be otherwise, more, earning an income, right? And, people have been watching these and benefiting from them. I actually should go through and look at the statistics again. I haven't done that for a long time, but I'm sure there's been like not millions of views necessarily of these videos, but at least hundreds of thousands of views of them. And, the bulk of the comments are pretty positive. There's people asking questions sometimes. Every once in a while you get somebody who's like, you suck, man, but for the most part, it's like, oh, this is really nice and helpful. And so I've got to meet a lot of really great people over time through doing these videos. Some of them, Hegelians, most of them not, many of them students. Bruce, who I mentioned earlier, is a great example. There have been quite a few other people who have been quite interested in what's going on with Hegel, and we've talked about it. And so I've benefited considerably myself from, so I put the videos out and those benefit other people, and I've benefited from people's engagements with me about it as well. The last thing I'll say about the project, other than, I'm going to continue seeing this through, obviously, is I'm not a Hegelian. I'm a philosophical eclectic. And it's interesting because when I do videos on Nietzsche, people think I'm a Nietzschean. If I do videos on the Stoics, they think I'm a Stoic. If I do videos on Aristotelianism, they think like I'm a hardcore Aristotelianism. I think that there's stuff that's valuable in all of these approaches. And, I think this is definitely a book that deserves, I don't want to say more love, but definitely more attention. And I'm happy to have contributed to doing it. There are better, there are way better Hegel scholars out there than me. I'm, he's not like my main focus of all of my research, but none of them wanted to do this. So, I'm the one who is willing to put in the time. And I did it in part also to try to, not just be able to provide something for other people, but also to try to encourage other people to do similar work. Now, I know there's a question up here about Marx. So let me jump into questions and comments. Julio Patino says Capital by Karl Marx. So I don't have to do any of Marx, right? Because David Harvey, who is, a high caliber Marx scholar, he's got videos doing a similar sort of thing, going through Marx and doing so, line by line, very attentively explaining what's going on. So that's cool, because I don't think I'd be up to doing Capital. That would take me forever. And, same thing with other thinkers, like, people are like, why don't you do this on Sartre's Being and Nothingness, or Schopenhauer's World, the will, the world is will and representation. I'm still a little bit sick, so I'm a little bit out of it. Ideally, somebody else would do those, right? Somebody who's like a full-time Schopenhauer scholar, full-time Sartre researcher. It would be cool to get them to do that. It doesn't all have to be me. I should stick to the text that I'm really good at. Like, one of the other ones I was thinking about doing was St. Anselm's Proslogion, going through it line by line, what's actually going on here, looking at the Latin. That wouldn't take anywhere near as long as, obviously, Hegel's Phenomenology. But, I think that I would like to see other people applying this half-hour thing. And it turns out a half hour is just about enough. The education experts are always like, oh, it can't be more than 5 minutes. People are going to, lose patience and they're not going to be able to concentrate. That turns out to be complete bullshit. And, who knows what was founded in, but that's completely wrong. An hour, probably too long. Half an hour is a good thing for this kind of intensive commentary. All right. Let's see. Tyson says, "Yay, Descartes! Happy Hegel Day." Thanks. Yeah, Descartes. I'm, again, I'm not a Cartesian, but I love teaching Descartes and reading Descartes. It's funny because there was a comment recently. Somebody posted about, like, French writers are all, kind of show offs, and it's hard to read their stuff. It's complex. And I was like, man, you haven't read a lot of French writing. Read Descartes. He's pretty straightforward in the discourse or in his letters or stuff like that. That's sort of like show offiness. That's from like the 1940s onward. Previous stuff is pretty straightforward. All right. Damn it, Albert says, humanities students that are too terrified of Hegel's impenetrable prose. Thanks for this. Hegel's not a great writer. I'm laughing because I'm remembering one of my philosophy professors from when I was an undergraduate, who was a German guy, and he was like, he grew up during World War II, and then emigrated to the United States, and he would always joke that he kept Hegel, and I don't know whether it was the Logic or which Logic or the philosophy of right or the Phenomenology on his bedstand. And whenever he found himself insomniac, he would read some Hegel, and by the end of the paragraph, he would be ready to go to sleep. And that's a little bit too far to the extreme, but yeah, Hegel's writing is pretty dense, and it often doesn't get better when you go to the German and look at the German. I haven't read Hippolyte's French translation for quite a while, but I will say this, that Hippolyte, actually, from what I remember, his French translation manages to be somehow more clear than Hegel's own German. It's probably also because Hippolyte has, like, it's copiously annotated with footnotes. And so I remember, I photocopied the 2 volumes of it. My mentor had it in his office, and I was like, hey man, can I photocopy these? Because he'd also written his own marginalia in the side, and I thought that was kind of important at the time. And I read through it and enjoyed it. All right. So Benjamin says, biggest event of the day, forget the Super Bowl. I'm just going to check the stats on the Super Bowl, because obviously I don't have a dog in that fight anymore, other than wanting to see Brady lose, like most of the country, I think, wherever he happens to be. And it's not even because the Buccaneers beat the Packers. I don't like the guy. And Patrick Mahomes, you can kind of root for him and root for the Chiefs. It would have been nice to have like a repeat of Super Bowl I with the Packers and the Chiefs playing, but that was not in the cards. So yeah, let's see if I missed anything. Chris has a funny joke. Are your consciousnesses actually here, or only a negative actuality? All right, let's see what else we have here. Another joke by Spookfessor, fairly short, aka the length of an average fiction book. Yeah, you mean the Phenomenology of Spirit? When I first read that as it was scrolling, I was like, he's trying to pull a fast one and say this is a book of fiction. And really, it is. I mean, there's no such thing as world spirit doing all the things that Hegel's saying that it's doing in any sort of literal sense. But yeah, I guess we could read it and say, what are we corresponding to figuratively here? By the way, speaking of fiction, after I get done with this, I am going to go off and be, the biggest dickhead I can possibly be. Dickhead, of course, meaning being a big fan of Philip K. Dick, who I'm doing this month for the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. And so once I get done with this and then probably decompress a little bit, I'm going downstairs into the room where the cat lives and spends most of her time. And it used to be the kids' bedroom, but now she's taken it over. And that's where I do some of my filming. So I'm going to be filming today the video that's going to premiere next Saturday for the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series on Philip K. Dick's novels that have to do with insanity and space colonization, like Maze of Death, Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. What am I blanking on? I can't remember them right offhand, but I'll be talking about those after I get off of here. And I'm having a special guest come in, my friend and collaborator, Michael Gomez, who is a psychologist and trains other psychologists. He's going to be talking about some of these psychiatric diagnoses that Dick is throwing around. So Hegel's not somebody who Dick talks about a lot, by the way. He actually does talk about Kant quite a bit, believe it or not. All right. Camille says Half Hour Hegel will be in the history books as one of the biggest projects in our internet era. Well, we'll see. I mean, it's not getting a lot of traction or notoriety in even the public philosophy domain of the internet. I think a lot of people don't know about it. It's kind of interesting because it's been going on now 7 years, right? So I probably should send out some press releases or things like that about the project if I want to get people interested in it. It's a labor of love, I'll tell you that, and it's one that I've invested a lot of time and thought into. So if there's 280 something videos right now, each of them half an hour, so that's 140 hours. Each hour of video footage is probably 10 hours of my work. So yeah, it's 1,400 hours of work that I've been doing. So all right. Dan the man says, wish I wasn't at work on a short break. The good thing about this is, you can always watch it afterwards, right? Gutter Grown is saying, number one, mapping the human genome. Then number two, mapping the Hegel. I don't know that it's quite that momentous, but it's good. Damn it, are you familiar with the work of Islamic Golden Age thinkers? Yeah, I'm familiar, but not an expert in it. Here's a good question from Spookfessor. Does religion, the section, suffer from Eurocentrism? Yeah, definitely. And it not only suffers from Eurocentrism, it suffers from Germano-Lutheran centrism as well. Hegel thinks that Europe is, and he includes, parts of the Mediterranean is really where the whole thing is happening, and this is a problem with his view on history. I think sort of like how Aristotle with his views on women which are pretty boneheaded. If you were to bring Aristotle into our present, get him past the culture shock that he'd incur, and then start having him interact with, women students and professors and all that, he'd rapidly revise his views on things. I think Hegel probably, given the opportunity, would take back some of the things that he's said about history. But he can't do that because he's dead, and he's been, gone since the 1840s. So, more than 160 years. It is Eurocentric. I don't think that means that we automatically, reject it or set it aside, but we have to contextualize, like when Hegel says that Africa has no history, obviously that's wrong. And he could have even figured out that was wrong in his day, but he didn't. And so we have to figure out, well, what are we going to do with that? All right, Marlon Henry Curse. William Desmond has books on Hegel's religiosity too. So do a whole ton of other people. Fackenheim. I think I've actually still got the book that I never returned to the SIU library. About the religious dimension of Hegel's thought on my shelves somewhere. There's lots of people who've talked about that. Yeah. All right. Let me see. It just skipped a little bit. Julian says, thank you for doing this. It's been a great tool for me in my independent study of Hegel. What is the biggest pitfall for beginners in reading and making sense of Hegel? That's a good question. I think, so my sort of like gut response is thinking that you have to understand everything in a paragraph or a section before moving on to the next one. I think that if you do that, you get stuck and you'll really never finish the book. I think it's okay to read things and then not fully understand what's going on and sort of pick it up the next reading or with what's being said later on. That not just for Hegel, but for philosophers in general. I think the first reading through should be sort of dodging things here and there and just trying to get yourself through it, and that's okay. That's normal. I would say the second biggest issue is, well, there's two other really big issues. Thinking that Hegel works by thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I mean, there are sometimes, so you look at the way the sections are set up, right? He does like threes. So in reason, right, you've got observing reason, and then the actualization of rational self-consciousness and individuality. And each of those big sections is divided into three sections. But that doesn't mean that it's actually thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's a different thing than, they call it Hegelian dialectic. They should call that bullshit Hegelian dialectic. What's actually going on is usually a lot more complicated. Every once in a while, it will actually coincide with that, but that's not the key to unlocking Hegel. And then, of course, the third thing is, don't believe the bullshit about the master-slave dialectic is the most important thing in Hegel, and everything else centers around that. You could say the master-slave dialectic is a very crude, primitive thing happening early on in the self-consciousness section, the other parts of which are attempts to go past that and introduce new and important content. And the recognition or lack of recognition that's happening and the development on the part of the slave, those are just motifs. They are not the essence of what Hegel's up to. So I think those could be helpful. Jake says, am I doing anything special for 100,000 views that I can talk about? Oh, subscriptions, yeah. Probably. I'll probably do another thing like this. My daughter has been eagerly awaiting for me to get to 100,000 views because something special happens in YouTube world. Like you get a special little thing on your channel or something like that. I don't actually know, but we're getting close. I should take a look. Where are we in terms of views? 97,400 subscribers is what it says in the little thing. So yeah, we're getting pretty close. I imagine we might pass it up in March. At the current rates that we're going in. So yeah, am I going to do something special? I gotta think about it. If anybody has any good suggestions, I'd be open to hearing them. Luke and Lazy, I know you're not a Hegelian, but what Hegelian ideas do you most agree with or like? So one thing I really, really love about Hegel is the insistence that ideas, if you want to evaluate an idea and understand an idea, it's got to be made actual. It's got to be made wirklich or real, right? And then what always ends up happening is just like when you plan stuff, right? Oh, we're going to have the best family reunion ever. We've got all the plans made. Things never turn out quite like that. You have to see what the essence of the thing is in its actuality, not just in your imagination, not just in potentiality, in how it actually shows itself. And Hegel, for the showing, it's not just that we're passive observers, like just sitting there watching it. It's instead we are also transformed in the process. I think he's completely right about that. That's an insight he shares with American pragmatists, with Maurice Blondel, with certain construals of Aristotle. It's kind of a good way to make sense of things. What else? I like the idea that I think he's right. The human consciousness has developed through our history. The history turns out to be more complex than he originally framed it, and it's more global than he framed it. There's that Eurocentric idea again, but I think he's right that and this is an idea, by the way, that again, not totally unique to Hegel. Aristotle even noted differences in how, drama, how dialogue was being written back in his own time. He's like, back in the old days, the people spoke like statesmen. Now they speak like rhetorics. So he's noticing temporal succession and trying to trace out, why that would be the case. Rousseau's another great example too, human beings, the sentiments, the very emotional capacities that we have developed over time. They're not just like hardwired into our DNA, right? So, all right. Jake asks, what is special about the religion section in the historical context of philosophy of religion? If we're talking about like contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, no interest in Hegel at all. If we're talking about philosophy of religion more broadly, I mean, it's a developmental account of religion, which is probably wrong. Most developmental accounts of religion, whatever religion you've got is like, the highest development, and all the other stuff are just, processes along the way. I don't really care for those sorts of accounts. I think a more pluralistic account is better. I don't really know that much in contemporary continental philosophy of religion, but I don't see an awful lot of reference to Hegel as such. I see more reference to Kierkegaard, which is not surprising. When I teach philosophy of religion, I do so from a comparative perspective. And so like when I talk about, the arguments for existence for God, which don't really come up in the phenomenology, but do in the lectures on the philosophy of religion, I talk about what the motivation for having these arguments is. And Hegel has some really interesting discussion of that. He says they're not supposed to prove anything, That's not the way people do religion. That's not the way people convert or anything like that. They're supposed to help you understand what God is, and what our relation to God is. So it all depends on how you look at it. Let's see here. Poe's Apprentice. Do you think Friedrich Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy was influenced by Hegel's phenomenology? No, I think it was influenced by Hegel. But it's important to remember that the phenomenology was not really widely read by people until the 20th century. Then it suddenly assumed a massive importance. Before that, it was more like the two logics, the science of logic and the encyclopedia logic, and of course, philosophy of right that people were paying more attention to. Nietzsche tells us that the Birth of Tragedy is too Hegelian. So presumably, why wouldn't he be influenced by the most influential thinker of the time at his time? There's going to be some influence. So, All right, let's see. Marianne Henry says nobody's done a half hour on Maurice Blondel. Nobody's done a half hour on hardly anybody. This whole YouTube thing is kind of new. At the time that I was starting this, so sort of a landmark for YouTube, right? There was YouTube that people were getting into in the early 2000s, and then around, I think it's 2011, an important transition was made. First, like if you didn't have an institutional account, you could only do videos that were like 10 minutes long, and then it was 15 minutes, and then it was 20 minutes, and then they opened it up to anything. So that was an important transition. The Half Hour Hegel project starts 3 years into that transition time. We're now 10 years down that line, and it's not that surprising that there aren't that many people doing this. I mean, first of all, you have to actually, if you're doing something in a foreign language, you got to be able to read that foreign language well, because you're giving, sort of an in-depth thing into it. You got to be willing to invest the time into something that is not going to be like commercially viable. The Half Hour Hegel Patreon project, I'm glad it's there. And I'm very grateful for all the people who have contributed to it through the years. It doesn't, would I be making minimum wage given the amount of time that I put in for the videos? Yeah, probably, it depends, on how many people are doing it at the time, but it's not something that most academics are going to say, yeah, man, I'm going to devote a number of hours each month to doing like William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, half an hour at a time, really close attention to the text, so. Jean asks, what's my stance on religion? I mean, that's too vague to even answer. I don't know what I would say to that. Malkia said, I saw you comment that the religion section of the Phenomenology used to be your favorite. Why was that? Because I was like super into philosophy of religion at the time. And I thought it was, a lot of cool stuff going on there in Hegel's Phenomenology. So, yeah. Let's see. Chris says, what main takeaways do you hope we, your Hegelian ducklings, get from your series apart from just the encouragement to get through the Phenomenology? That's a good question. I mean, I hope you also get encouragement to read Hegel for yourself. I know that there are like Hegel reading groups that have organized and are using this as a resource, but presumably a lot of the discussion that they're having is not, well, Dr. Sadler says, or, but it's more like, well, Hegel's saying this, and here's some people over on the side who have some useful ideas about it. What are we going to do with this text right now? And I'll do a little bit of storytelling here. We did a Hegel reading group twice in my graduate school, and I was a part of it. And what we would do is we'd get together at like a bar or a cafe, and sometimes people's houses, and we would each person would be like assigned a section to summarize and lead us through. And I did parts of the religion section, and I did the master-slave dialectic because I was like, one of the Hegel guys in the department at the time. And, we would get together, and usually, we'd be drinking, and I would, back then I was living in a trailer park south of town in Carbondale and riding around on my bike because I didn't have a car. And, it was a very hard drinking department. And I remember there was what we call the philosophy house on the north end of town in Carbondale. I might be mixing things up. I think I was on the south side and they were on the north side. And, it was a bunch of philosophy guys who lived there. And so they partied a lot. And we would go there, and there was a liquor store like just 2 blocks from there. So that's where everybody would be before that, buying their drinks. And I would buy, like a 40 ouncer of MGD draft, and because it was super cheap. It was like $1 something, and then walk over to the philosophy house, and we would do philosophy and drink some beer, or people drank liquor or whatever, and smoked a lot too, and had a good time discussing it. And I think that that's part of it too. People are having these groups, people are continuing these discussions. What else should people get from the series? Ideally, the series is just there to provide you with some clarification. You don't have to feel like you have to watch every single one. I think they can be used kind of in a targeted way. Like you get to you're reading around the paragraph 492, and you're like, what the hell is going on here? Well, that's the time maybe to go to the series and see what somebody else has to say about it. And some of the time I might say, what the hell's going on here, right? Hitchcock, I imagine Hegel was much more fun to talk to than to read. His lectures are pretty straightforward compared to like the Phenomenology, but that's his students helping out with that, right? He seems to have been they talk about him being melancholic, but he seems to have been a pretty decent guy. And I think I would have enjoyed like sitting down and chatting with the guy myself, and probably a lot of you would as well. Let's see. Hidit Phil, could you please explain how you managed to learn German, French, Greek, and still have read this much? Well, I'm 50 years old, so I've lived a long time, probably twice as long as some of the people who are commenting here. I was at an advantage when it comes to French in that my mother's family is French Canadian, and my mother, even though she was a fourth generation immigrant, grew up speaking French at home because her mom was from Quebec, and my grandfather, he spoke French before English as well, even though he was a third generation immigrant. So I grew up in the generation, I'm one of the older people in my generation in the family, the Lemrise family. And I grew up hearing all the old people speaking French, admitted, of course, Canadian French, not Parisian French. And, you just pick up some of that. You don't actually like learn any grammar or anything, but you learn a little bit of vocabulary, and you learn some of the affective nuances and some of the really basic words. And then my mom made me take French when I was in 8th grade and when I was in 10th grade in high school. And I didn't want to like learn it, but I picked up some stuff in the process. She made me learn it because I should learn some proper grammar. And I screwed around in class and got by on the French that I already knew, And then when I was in college, I got thrown into this French house. They were trying these language suites, and they had like a native language speaker and then, other people who were like supposed to be learning the language. And they found out that I learned French. So they threw me in there, and I was like, well, I get my own room. So that's awesome. I'll do that. And we had to take a class in French, and the textbook itself was in French. And so I finally like buckled down, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to learn French. And so I did, and then when I was in, then I traveled to Quebec and, met up with some of my relatives and hung out in Montreal and went to Europe and came back to, go to grad school and just kept on with the French, right? So that was good. All the old people are dead now, so there's not a lot of people in my family to talk French with, which is kind of a sad thing, but that's life. The German, I began learning some rudiments of German when I was in elementary school, but in sort of a half-assed way, of course. Because Wisconsin, the part of Wisconsin I lived in, you were probably either German or Welsh if you lived in the village of Wales. And so, we'd have people who'd like go to Germany and exchange things and come back and, teach a little bit. And then I never really buckled down with it until I got, I lived in Germany as a soldier, right? And so I learned some basic German, enough to get by, but never like studied the language. And then, there were people in the German house and I'd chit chat with them. But it was sort of like, drinking and eating German. And then I got myself a Teach Yourself German book from my Uncle Hubert's library. Turned out it was from 1896. And so I learned, some old German script and stuff like that. And which is very useful when I was reading Hegel, because the Hegel German book, the German Hegel book that I had was the second edition copy of the Phenomenology, which was in the old Fraktur. And I just, kept up with it. And then, I'll start reading stuff in the language and going to like Stammtisch and chit-chatting with people. And, I went over back to Germany. And so, that was good. Greek, I learned in a more formal way, taking classes. Latin, I kind of learned on my own, but I had the advantage of having had some baby Latin in sixth and seventh grade, because I went to a private middle school, where you were either rich or smart, and they had Latin class there. We didn't go that far, but and then later on, I was able to use that basis and get my Latin up to decent par. All right. Let's see here. Jose is asking a Philip K. Dick question. So he's obviously a dickhead too. How about Vallis? So Vallis, I talked about in another Dick thing when I talked about Philip K. Dick's Alternative America. I may mention Vallis, but I probably will not look at it in a thematic way in this one. All right, Chris says, my best friend and I started reading this Hegel together in September just because we heard it was hard to read. He gave up partway through the introduction, but I'm almost at the end of Spirit. In joking retaliation for abandoning me, I wrote an 8-page paper on his development as a consciousness using dense Hegelian language as I could muster for his most recent birthday. That is awesome. That's really funny. That's the sort of crap that we would pull in graduate school, when we had more time on our hands and probably more energy, and we like to, zing each other. That is a really great story. All right. Luke and Lazy, what do you think of people identifying as Hegelian, Nietzschean, etc., as it is a sign of a second-rate mind to wholly follow someone else's philosophy? I mean, not necessarily so. I mean, there are some people who are convinced that, Hegel fundamentally had it right, and there's Hegelian in the sense of okay, I'm a follower of Hegel, and then there's I'm a researcher on Hegel, and that's what I do my most work on. You can also go through phases. I went through many phases where I was, convinced that somebody finally had the right thing, including a Nietzschean phase, right? And that was probably one of my longer phases. Not least because it gave me sort of a good, explanation for why it's okay to be a jerk, which I was doing at the time. And not just a jerk, but an elitist jerk. So, no, I don't think it necessarily betokens having a second-class, second-rate mind. Sometimes it can be quite useful. And, sometimes we have some really great expositors of these other thinkers, right? But I kind of get where you're going. There are a lot of people who kind of glom on to philosophers and use them. Hegel's susceptible to that. Nietzsche, Marx, Deleuze is another big one today. And they're like, oh, as a blah, 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 actually Stoicism too is a great example. I run into all these people who are like, I'm a Stoic and, I know all about Stoicism. And it turns out that me, not a Stoic, has actually forgotten more than the Stoicism that they claim to know, in part because I spent a lot of time studying it, right? Maybe there should be some line that you have to cross before you get to label yourself as a -IAN or IT or something like that. Odlin, can I recommend any philosophy of music? It's not really an area that I know very well, so there's not much for me to say about that, unfortunately. It just looks like it just scrolled a little bit. Let's see what we got here. The Now Church says Hegel was Eurocentric, but his version of Christianity is way better than the mainstream. It depends on what the mainstream is, where you are, I guess, EB, when Hegel claims the night of black cows, isn't he still seeing black cows in the night rather than just absolute darkness? He seems to be able to delineate the cows' form and content. He's doing so thinking about it, but I mean, he could just be like bumping into them, right? You've all been on camping trips, I imagine, when it's like pitch black, right? Golden Apple's excited to be here for the Hegel-party. Thanks for putting this together. Glad that you enjoy that. Richard Gallen says, thanks for the work. You're very welcome. The Now Church says, just celebrated Bob Marley yesterday, Hegel today, and you brought up Philip K. Dick. That's great. Spookfessor, how do you feel about Hegel using reconciliation to bring up God and then religion? To me, it's one of the weirdest arguments he makes. Well, it's not an argument. So if you start by saying it's something different, a rational account rather than an argument, you'll find it a little bit easier, I suppose. Aaron McNally has a question about Stoicism. What do you consider to be essential Stoicism? What text must one really know? Well, there's the big three, right? So we've got Seneca, who wrote quite a few things, including the letters, sometimes translated moral letters, letters to Lucilius, letters on ethics. They're all the same thing. And then he's got all these treatises, like, on anger, on on constancy, different consolations. So we've got a lot of Seneca stuff. And then there's Epictetus, the Discourses and the Enchiridion. And then we've got Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And I would say that, Seneca and Epictetus are more important than Marcus Aurelius for understanding Stoicism. That's just the way it is. Marcus is writing to himself. It's much less systematic. It's great stuff, but it's not. It shouldn't be like the go-to, which unfortunately it is for a lot of modern Stoics. I would say you definitely want to also read the lectures that we have by Musonius Rufus, and you want to read Arius Didymus's Epitome of Stoic Ethics. Probably should read Heracles if you get your hands on that. And then there's like texts by Cicero Cicero's not a Stoic, but the stuff that he's giving you on Stoicism is the straight dope. So, On Ends, Book 3, Stoic Paradoxes, On the Nature of the Gods, Book 2, On Duties, the entirety of it. It's essentially a Stoic text filtered through Cicero. And, if you want to read On Divination, you can, or the Academics, but you're not going to get that much from it. And I would say that what makes a person a modern Stoic is that they have gone past I'm going to read Tim Ferriss or Ryan Holiday or whatever, which is fine as a starting point, but is definitely not enough. And they've moved into actual Stoic texts, and there's a continual dialectic going back and forth where they are not just practicing, right? They're actually using this as a philosophy, as a way of life, to restructure their life, to use their faculty of choice to fix their faculty of choice. And likewise, what we call the rational faculty or the ruling faculty, all those are, by the way, the same thing. So that's what I would say. Pavle has a question here. Do I have a take on Brandam's interpretation of Hegel, or more generally, the recent analytic interest in Hegel? So Brandam is like, in analytic philosophy, would be like Kojève in continental philosophy. You're definitely getting something that is connected to Hegel. You're also getting something that's definitely not straight Hegel, but is that person's reinterpretation of it. And it's with both Kojève and Brandam, they're both smart guys and have something to contribute, so they're worth reading. Just don't read it as if that's the straight Hegel, And the recent wave of analytic interest in Hegel, I wouldn't say there's a wave of it. I would say there's a mild interest in it. I wouldn't even say there's a wave of analytic interest in Nietzsche. I think you can talk about a wave of interest in Thomas Aquinas, largely driven by Eleanor Stumpf and St. Louis University and all the graduates that have come out of there, and it's usually not very good. I mean, the more analytic it is, usually the less good it is in terms of history of philosophy and engaging the text. The more Brandam gets sort of an honorary induction as a historian of philosophy because he is coming out of an analytic background, but he leaves behind a lot of the limitations of analytic philosophy. And in so doing, effectively ceases to be an analytic. So that's what I would say. All right. Damn, it says I was definitely one of those thesis, antithesis, synthesis folks. For some reason, I see everyone on YouTube talking about that exclusively. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with YouTube is it's people are there, you know, the people who are doing the popular philosophy things, they are there to either, and there will be some exceptions to this, but they are there to make money, establish themselves as like a celebrity, not an authority, but a celebrity, or get as many subscribers as possible. And so putting out kind of crap content, that's kind of par for the course, right? Spookfester says YouTube sends you out a giant metal play button at 1,000K subscriptions. Well, that would be cool. I don't know what I would do with it. All right, so there's some back and forth I'm going to skip over here in terms of like the religion stuff. I'm glad that you're having a good conversation there. Spookfester, when I first read Spirit, I assumed the third section following the French Revolution would be about Napoleon. Since I knew he loved Napoleon, I struggled to read morality because of that. Yeah, I mean, there's really no reference to Napoleon in, maybe it's the Lord of the World, thing earlier on in the reason section. But there's not a lot of references to historical people in general in that, right? Aaron says, what I love about Dr. Sadler is roughly zero sentimentality for any idea or way of thinking. Yeah, and that's something that has happened over time. I think I was a lot more sentimental about ideas or ways of thinking in the past, but after a while that gets you kind of worn off. Guttergrown says he's partial to virtue theory. Virtue theory as an abstraction is not something I'm partial to, because that's all bullshit. Where people are like, virtue theory is the idea that, and then they have like a couple bullet points. I'm partial to virtue theories in a substantive sense. So I like Plutarch as a representative, Middle Platonist. I like Aristotle and Alexander of Aphrodisias and Alistair MacIntyre in the present as good representatives. Well, and also, plenty Gisela Stryker and people like that. I like Stoicism as a virtue ethics, but I don't like virtue ethics in general. I think virtue ethics done as an abstraction is just a silly, way of trying to like say, oh, there's something beyond these other things. By the way, I'll say the same thing about utilitarianism. When people want to talk about utilitarianism, I want them to have actually like engaged with Bentham and Mill and preferably like Sidgwick and Singer, right? It's very important to do that. Let's see. Randolph Frode view on Kierkegaard. Very interesting guy. I like Kierkegaard quite a bit. I don't really buy the, it's all about the leap of faith kind of thing, because there's so much else going on in his work. Pagan Tree, have I done any videos on Philip Mainlander? You can always find what videos I've done easily by just using the search function. If you don't find anything in search, I haven't done any videos on that guy, right? Tony says, thank you, Dr. Sadler. The Half Hour Hegel series has been and continues to be a huge help in my Hegel class. Well, that's good to know, right? So long as your professor doesn't get mad at you for using it. Magnus, what is the philosophical motive of this book in this section? Why it is written, what it is about? Well, I talked a little bit about that at the start of this. Hegel seems to think that religion is something very important for human beings, and that it brings together all these other aspects. It's not as good as philosophy, but it's certainly like on the way to philosophy, right? Agnostic Monkey, what's your opinion on the projection theory of property rights? Hegel promoted that. I don't know what the projection theory of property rights is. Caring Love Faith, French is a difficult language. I will love to learn one day. It is a difficult language, in part because, like in English, the spelling doesn't tell you how things actually sound most of the time. And there are some there's some phonemes in it that are hard for a lot of people. Like, when I was talking about living in the French house, so we had this woman, Cécile Revoltissot, who lived there, who was from Toulouse. And she would, make us pronounce difficult to pronounce words for English speakers, like écureuil, squirrel. And some of the other students just could not wrap their palate or tongue around it. There is an advantage to have a French-speaking mom, right? And the tense structure of it is kind of screwy. There's literary tenses that nobody uses anymore, but were used at one time. Yeah, the good thing is the vocabulary isn't that big. I think the lexicon of French is like 1/6 the size of English, because English has so many loan words. I think English is harder to learn than French, but yeah. Gutter Grown, how long does it take to get a basic grasp of a language? How many hours a week? I don't know. I imagine that probably varies from person to person, right? All right. A lot of back and forth here. Somebody who it just skipped over said that they were a dickhead too. Callum O'Connor, I'm a massive dickhead. Sean Smith, Philip K. Dick, do you think if an AI demonstrates altruism, it would be logic to consider it sentient? Sure. Yeah, Dick would. That was one of the problems with the replicants in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, right? They don't have empathy for other beings. They could demonstrate altruism without empathy, though. But empathy is really a key thing for Philip K. Dick. Lauren says, I just wanted to say, excuse me, I found your channel recently and I love it. Thanks for the huge amount of high quality content. I'm glad that you enjoy it. And I'm really fortunate in that I was sort of like in the right place at the right time to, have developed the repertoire that I had over the years, which is not because I was, doing all the right things. Like I said, when I was a graduate student, I was, screwing around a lot, drinking, exercising a ton, like 3 hours a day sometimes. That was part of that whole Nietzschean kick. But I managed to learn a lot in the process, in part because of the way the curriculum was structured, with the very difficult prelims, with massive reading lists and stuff like that. And then I was able to, be established. And I'll mention another thing. My wife, who's just below, actually listening to a seminar on Heidegger, she was one of the main impetuses for me to put stuff on YouTube in the first place, because she's an early adopter of technology and was very much sort of like a cheerleader, for giving things a try. And I, said, well, who's going to watch this? I'm a nobody. I teach at that time some poor, historically Black university. I don't have a lot of, people know my work on Anselm and Hobbes, but that's about it. And that's in some very narrow circles. Who's actually going to watch this? And she said, just put it out there, just try it out. And so I did. And it was kind of a good feedback loop. People found it useful, and I just kept at it, And so if I had been, I don't know, maybe 10 years more along in my career, or, wasn't with my, at that time, fiance, now wife, maybe I wouldn't have done it, All right. Florga says, am I familiar with Zizek's interpretation of Hegel? If you are, what's your thoughts on it? So Zizek could be somebody sort of like, again, Kojève or Brandom. It is definitely an interpretation. It's not like what I'm trying to do in the commentary video, sticking very closely to the text, or what Hippolyte more or less tried to do. I'd say Stanley Rosen kind of did in his own time as well. You're getting more Zizek than you're getting Hegel, but if you like Zizek, then that's nice for you. Unmasked Hamburglar, are Hegelian dialectics and Deleuzian idea of multiplicity rhizomes mutually excluding? Only if you make them so. You could think of it as sort of like Deleuze is not just rejecting Hegel, but also working within this Hegel-influenced background / system and doing his own thing, right? Tony, here's a good question about, especially in terms of the religion stuff. What do you think about Kierkegaard's understanding and treatment of Hegel? Also, I found a website that sells Stoic hoodies because nothing says Stoic like a hoodie. Yeah, all that. So I'm going to talk about the second thing first. If you're really a Stoic, you don't buy any Stoic paraphernalia. You don't buy challenge coins. You don't like buy a bumper sticker. You definitely don't need to get a tattoo to show everybody how you're a Stoic. If it's really anti-Stoic. It goes against the view. I mean, if you could say, oh, well, I put memento mori on my wrist to remind me to do that, Seneca would say, geez, you dummy, why did you put it on there? Why don't you put it in here? You're just showing off, right? So there's a lot of that, but there's a lot of that for everything, right? I mean, look at me. I'm wearing my Kiss Army t-shirt right now, because I like Kiss. I don't like Gene Simmons so much, but I like the band. Stoicism shouldn't be reduced to that. It is, because anything that actually tends to be popular. I mean, think about just yoga, right? If somebody tells me they practice yoga, I'm always like, hey, so what do you think of the Yoga Sutras? How you're reading Patanjali, and they're like, Patan what? And I'm like, you're not doing yoga then, I guess, But there's all this sort of stuff going on. Now, Kierkegaard, his understanding and treatment of Hegel. There's two things to say. Kierkegaard understands Hegel, and he is not actually targeting Hegel as such all the time. He's more targeting Hegelians, particularly the Hegelians in Denmark and in Germany, where he studied. And a lot of those are, sort of like, they learn the Hegelian shtick and they do the stuff. He is very worried about Hegel's. So we talked about this earlier, right? There's religion and then there's philosophy, and religion is kind of a preparation for philosophy. Kierkegaard is perfectly willing to say that, yeah, like what most people call religion, which isn't really religion at all, is something that's lower than philosophy. Genuine faith, maybe not. I mean, if Kierkegaard were around today and looked at most people who call themselves Christians, he, like I, would say, well, actually, a lot of you are actually antichrists. You're not remotely Christian, and you're just doing things to get something out of it. I mean, I always, when somebody wants to like throw Bible verses at me, first thing I always do is say, so how are you living out the Sermon on the Mount? How's that going for you? And if they don't have a response, well, they're full of crap, or struggling, right? And they wound up with a bad bunch, in their church. If they're always like talking about, culture war stuff, but they're not actually showing charity to their neighbor, they're not a real Christian. And Kierkegaard writes about a lot of this kind of stuff, right? So I think he's pretty good on that. Does he know everything? No, but he's good. All right. Damon says, did Rousseau hate civilization or just Paris? Both, So it wasn't just Paris. That's not the only place where you have civilization. Let's see here. All right. I'm getting a little bit late, so I'm going to scroll down a bit. A lot of these are people who've posted stuff before. Galen says, you once made a video on the top 10 philosophical works you bring to a desert island. I would watch another series you did on any one of the other 9. You mean like a half-hour series? Yeah, I mean, again, I mentioned this at the top of the thing. I'm going to see what I'll do and what I'm actually capable of doing when I get to that point. I also hope that other people will take up the methodology and do books that I don't do. Oh, Stacy says, happy Chinese New Year along with Hegel celebration. Is it Chinese New Year? Well, Gong Shi Fa Cai, I'm glad to hear it. I need to check the internet about what the date is, Elon, any discussions between Judaism and Hegel's thought? Yeah, Fackenheim, who I mentioned earlier, but Hegel's going to talk about Judaism in there a bit in that section. A lot of back and forth here. Joey says, just hopping on, but great to see you going strong. Glad to see you doing content on Hegel. Thanks. Yeah. Tyson says, what's the reason for the rejection of Hegel and analytic philosophy? Is that due to Russell and Moore and the early British Hegelians? Yeah, so early on, the rejection is about rejecting not just Hegel really, but Bradley and Green and all those people. Later analytic philosophers just don't read Hegel and don't read really anybody that's not within their sphere, with some exceptions, like John Wisdom, who's a great analytic philosopher who reads all sorts of people, but he's and Alistair McIntyre, who obviously quits being an analytic at a certain point. Those are the exceptions to the rule. And at a certain point, there's this like open contempt for anything that's not within their sphere. And we're talking several generations after Russell and Moore. I remember actually having a professor who openly at SIU, and she was not an analytic, but she was a Peirce scholar. We were talking about the Hegel reading group, and she like looked over and unironically said, "Why would anyone want to read Hegel?" And at that point, my already shaky, esteem for her dropped completely. I was like, why would you say that about anybody who's a great philosopher? There's just a lot of like, oh, that's, I already know about that stuff. I'm never going to try it out, which is sort of like people who say that they're no good at math, or they can't dance or stuff like that. They never try it out, right? So, yeah. All right, let's see what else I can take and then kind of wrap this up. Yeah, Stacy says you taught at a historically black university at Fayetteville State, second oldest university in the North Carolina system, and constantly treated like crap because the Republicans run North Carolina through gerrymandering and voter suppression and stuff like that. Yeah, it was quite interesting to work there. Spookfester, do you have many students studying Hegel? No, because I'm not actually teaching Hegel on any of the classes that I'm doing now. I have taught Hegel in the past, and the biggest thing to struggle with is like figuring out what the hell is this crap, right? Because of the writing, right? All right. Guys, are you thinking of writing a lexicon book for the Phenomenology of Spirit? I am definitely not. There's plenty of people out there who've done all sorts of great, book commentaries on the work. There's no reason for me to do it, particularly not Hegel not being the center of my research. Now, it's interesting that you bring up this idea of a lexicon book, because someday down the line, I would like to do a book that is a lexicon of the philosophical, religious, and psychological terminology in Philip K. Dick's novels and short stories. That I think would actually be worth my doing, right? Here's a good thing from Lisa. People who want to learn a language, check with your public library to see if you have access to Canopy. They have great courses available. There's several languages. There are all sorts of platforms and apps, and you usually can get them through your local library, and you can usually do it online. But that's an excellent way to do it. When I was trying to work on some of my languages back then, it was tapes that you would get from the library, and I'd do it while I was working out. Like I'd put weights in my backpack and go take a 5-mile walk around Milwaukee, listening to somebody chatting German in my ears. Yeah. Stian, what do you think about Crowley and his philosophy, Religion of Thelema? I've never taken him seriously at all. And I've had a few people who were really, really were interested in turning me on to it, and I never turned. More back and forth stuff. Board Grass, congrats. I always refer to Half Hour Hegel as an example for the web as a learning source. Do the files stay on YouTube for latecomers and slow learners? Yeah, obviously they're there. You just have to. There's a whole playlist of them. Why wouldn't they stay on YouTube? It's not as if they go away after a month or something. They're all out there. Now, if YouTube ever goes down, well, then that's a problem. And I do need to start, I think, downloading the older videos. I was actually going to pick it up and point, but I don't want to take the chance of unplugging it. I've got a big hard drive here that has all of my videos from about like 2016, 2015 on them. I probably should go back in time and download all that content so it's available in more than one place. But yeah, it's all there. Let's see here. Elijah, in light of the work of Bart Ehrman, do you think of the Gospels of John and Matthew to be at least representative of what Christianity should be today, what it should have become? So the work of Bart Ehrman, I would say there's like a great Bart Ehrman period, and then there's a like slide into garbage scholarship period that begins with his stuff on the Gospel of Judas, where at that point I was like, Jesus, I can't take this guy seriously anymore. How the mighty have fallen. I don't see why the work of Bart Ehrman should make me think of the Gospels of John and Matthew in any different way, any more than the many other biblical scholars that are out there that are less adept at getting themselves into the public spotlight. So, yeah, but let's say that we got rid of all these gospel scholars. John and Matthew and Luke and Mark are normative for Christian thought, and it's been that way for 2 millennia. I don't know how like adding one more biblical critic to the mix changes anything. So this is funny. Every time that somebody writes "dick," it's like flagging it, and so I have to click to let it be there. All right, let's see here. Thamar creates, why is Miguel de Montaigne not mentioned on philosophy much? Same reason like 99% of philosophers are not mentioned on philosophy much. Diligent Escape, Matthew and Luke were thought to have been Q-sourced. I don't care. I mean, when I taught religious studies classes, I read that. It doesn't matter that they were sourced. You look at what their role was within the church and what the content is. People are always all about source. Let's see. I think I'm going to scroll up very quickly, see if there's anything that I particularly missed. There's a lot of back and forth discussions. Here's a good one to go out on. What do I think of G.K. Chesterton? I enjoy his fiction quite a lot. I think as an essayist, he's a little bit given to, like, well, here's a paradox, kind of thing. But I enjoy him quite a bit. I often don't enjoy Chestertonians quite as much because they usually tend to be, Catholic culture warriors and into all sorts of other things that Chesterton if he was brought to the present would be like, well, that's bullshit, But I like Chesterton. I actually did I devoted one of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series lectures to Chesterton. I think that was in the 2nd or 3rd year of the series. You can go to that playlist and find it. So I'm going to close here. Thanks for all of the comments and questions. Glad all of you could join me here for this celebrating crossing an important passage. The last thing that I'll mention, and I should have mentioned it in the AMA yesterday, and my wife reminded me during it, but I forgot to do it, is we've got a cool online event happening here in Milwaukee, but obviously it's online, so it's available for the entire world. And it's in Eventbrite. You can easily find it. It's using Aristotle's theory of friendship to understand relationships. We're doing kind of a Valentine's Day themed event. It's also in my Facebook page. I'm going to be putting it on the Reason.io calendar shortly with the Eventbrite page. So if you want to do that, that's fine. It's sort of a repeat of something that I've done in the past, but sort of updating it for the present, particularly thinking about COVID times, where relationships are often mediated, right, through digital means. And so it should be a fun workshop to do. So if you're interested in that, it's easy enough to find on the web. Yeah, glad all of you could join me here, and I'll see you it's either that online event or one of the other online events or one of the AMAs or political discussions. And hopefully we'll have another Hegel celebration before too long, because we'll get to the end of the religion section and into absolute knowing. But I think that's going to be a while from now. We'll probably hit the 100,000 subscribers before that.